Welcome back to Valencia Tales, wishing you a truly good day, filled with calm moments and gentle things ahead. And now, let's step together into today's story.
My brother fired me the moment he became president of our family's luxury resort empire. "You don't have what it takes to run a business," he said smugly as he personally cleared out my office, like he'd rehearsed the moment for years. I didn't argue. I simply gave him a slow, sarcastic smile. He completely panicked when my brother was packing my office into cardboard boxes and he was enjoying it. "You don't have what it takes to run a business, Blair," Clay said, placing my grandmother's framed photo into a box like he was handling trash. 9 days. That's how long he'd been CEO of our family's resort empire before he fired me. 17 years I'd spent building Crescent Bay from the ground up, turning failing properties into destinations, training staff, managing every crisis at 3 in the morning, and he erased me in 20 minutes. Before we continue, if you believe that hard work and loyalty should be valued over family politics and business, please consider subscribing. It's free and helps us share stories of resilience. Now let's see what Blair does next. I didn't argue. I didn't beg. I just reached into my desk drawer and pulled out my grandmother's old compass, the one she'd used to scout our first property back in 1978. Clay didn't even know it existed. He'd never bothered to learn the history of what we'd built. "Good luck with the Monterey renovation," I said, giving him a slow, sarcastic smile. His hand froze. Just for a second I saw panic flicker across his face. That $18 million project was hemorrhaging money and falling further behind every week. He'd need me to fix it. But I wouldn't be there. "We've brought in consultants from Ritz-Carlton," he recovered, his voice dripping with smugness. "They've handled properties 3 times that size." I nodded and picked up my box. What Clay didn't know, what he'd been too busy giving keynote speeches and charming investors to notice, was that 4 years ago, I'd bought the land underneath our 3 most profitable properties. And in exactly 10 weeks, those lease renewals were coming due. My name is Blair Hartwick. And this is the story of how my brother fired me the moment he became president, and how he completely panicked when he realized what I'd been planning all along. But to understand how we got here, you need to understand what I built. What Clay was so eager to destroy. I was 22 when I started at Crescent Bay, fresh out of Stanford with a business degree and job offers from consulting firms that promised 6-figure salaries and corner offices. My mother Margaret had built the company from a single struggling roadside inn into a 6-property luxury resort empire spanning California's coastline. Everyone assumed I'd take a glamorous role, investor relations maybe, or corporate strategy. Something with a title that looked good on business cards. Instead I chose operations. Not because I lacked ambition, but because I'd watched my grandmother build our first property through attention to details that nobody else valued. She'd understood something fundamental. Luxury wasn't about marble lobbies and celebrity endorsements. It was about the small, invisible things that made guests feel cared for without knowing why. While Clay spent his 20s at MBA networking events and investor cocktail parties, learning to charm venture capitalists and perfect his elevator pitch about disrupting the luxury hospitality space, I spent mine learning how resorts actually worked. I shadowed our housekeeping director Maria at 5 in the morning, watching her train new staff on hospital corners and the precise way to fold towels so they looked like art. I learned to negotiate with organic produce suppliers in Spanish because our head chef insisted that authentic relationships produced better ingredients than corporate contracts ever could. I troubleshot HVAC failures during Christmas weekend when our Big Sur property lost heating and 200 guests were threatening to check out. I spent 14 straight hours with our maintenance supervisor Tommy, both of us covered in grease and dust, jury-rigging a solution that kept everyone comfortable until the replacement parts arrived. Tommy taught me how to read building systems like a language, how to anticipate failures before they happened, how to maintain equipment so it lasted decades instead of years. These weren't moments that made it into investor presentations or industry magazine profiles. Nobody wrote articles about the time I stayed up all night helping our kitchen staff prepare breakfast after our morning cook had a family emergency. Nobody gave awards for the training protocols I developed that reduced our staff turnover by 40%. Or the vendor relationships I built that got us better prices without sacrificing quality. But they mattered. They built something real. By the time I was 30, I'd personally transformed 3 underperforming properties into destination resorts that guests booked 6 months in advance. Monterey had been my proudest achievement. A faded 1980s hotel with good bones and a spectacular coastal location that nobody was marketing properly. I'd overseen every detail of its renovation, not just the architectural decisions that Clay later took credit for in board presentations, but the small touches that separated adequate hotels from unforgettable experiences. The thread count of our sheets, 600 Egyptian cotton, washed exactly 3 times before guest use to achieve optimal softness without that stiff new fabric feel. The height of our shower heads, positioned to accommodate both tall guests and average height without requiring adjustment. The scent profile in our lobbies, a custom blend that evoked coastal sage and sea air without being overwhelming. The training protocols that taught our front desk staff to remember returning guests' drink preferences and room location choices without making it feel intrusive or creepy. Those details drove our occupancy rates to 92% year-round when our competitors averaged 70%. They earned industry recognition, awards that Clay accepted on behalf of the company while I stayed behind managing the properties that actually generated the revenue. They created a culture where staff took genuine pride in their work because they understood they weren't just cleaning rooms or checking in guests. They were creating experiences that people remembered for years. Monterey became our highest revenue location, generating returns that funded Clay's expansion dreams and investor presentations about scaling the brand nationally. My office during all of this was a converted storage room on the 3rd floor of our Palo Alto headquarters. It had no windows, barely enough space for my desk and the filing cabinets that held 17 years of operational documentation, and a persistent smell of cleaning supplies from the janitor's closet next door. Meanwhile, Clay occupied the executive suite our mother had designed for him on the top floor, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking San Francisco Bay, custom furniture from Italy, original artwork on the walls. I never minded. Not really. I measured success differently than Clay did. He counted magazine features and speaking invitations and LinkedIn followers. I counted guest satisfaction scores that stayed above 95% and staff who'd been with us for 10, 15, 20 years because they felt valued. I counted the thank you notes we received from families who'd created memories at our properties, from couples who'd gotten engaged at our Big Sur location, from guests who returned every year because our staff remembered them. We were building different things even if we were supposedly building them together. That compass I kept in my desk drawer was more than just a family heirloom. My grandmother had used it in the 70s when scouting coastal properties, driving up and down California in a beat-up station wagon looking for locations with untapped potential. Our first property had been that failing roadside inn in Monterey that everyone told her was a terrible investment. Too small, too dated, wrong location. She'd seen something they hadn't. She'd understood that foundations matter more than facades, that the unglamorous work of building something solid outlasts the temporary shine of surface appeal. That compass reminded me every single day what actually mattered. Not Clay's investor pitches or our mother's strategic vision or the industry recognition. The work itself. The people. The guests. The foundation. The family dynamic that shaped all of this was subtle enough that it took me years to recognize the pattern. Our mother Margaret was brilliant. She'd grown Crescent Bay through shrewd acquisitions and an instinct for coastal locations that would appreciate in value. But she was also trapped in some outdated belief system where sons needed to be groomed for leadership while daughters could be brilliant in supporting roles. Clay has vision, she'd say, usually over family dinners where she'd ask him about strategic initiatives and ask me to give us the quick operational update. You have execution. That's what makes you both valuable. When I was younger, that felt like praise. Both valuable. Both important. As I got older, I recognized it as a limitation. Clay, 4 years younger than me, had been sent to elite business schools and given media training. He'd been introduced to venture capital circles and taught to speak their language of disruption and scale and market capture. He'd been positioned from adolescence as the future of Crescent Bay, the heir apparent who would take Margaret's regional success and scale it nationally. I'd been positioned as operations. The dependable sister who made Clay's vision possible. The invisible backbone. Family dinners became a ritual of this dynamic. Margaret would spend 30 minutes discussing Clay's latest investor meeting or his thoughts on expanding into the Pacific Northwest. She'd spend 5 minutes on my operational update, usually interrupting if I went into too much detail because we don't need to get lost in the weeds. I watched Clay take credit for successes I'd engineered. Watched him charm board members with presentations built from data I'd compiled, insights I'd developed, strategies I'd designed. Watched my name gradually disappear from investor materials and press releases until the narrative of Crescent Bay's success became exclusively about his leadership and vision. The erosion was insidious. Not dramatic enough to confront without seeming petty or jealous, but corrosive enough that our sibling bond dissolved completely over the years. By the time Clay became CEO, we were colleagues who happened to share DNA, not family who happened to work together. About 18 months ago, the erosion accelerated into something more deliberate. Clay stopped including me in strategic planning meetings, claiming they were high-level vision sessions that didn't require operational input. He began questioning my budget recommendations in front of junior staff, undermining my authority in ways that seemed small individually but were devastating cumulatively. He reassigned my best people, property managers I'd personally hired and trained, to projects he controlled directly, gradually building a parallel operational structure that excluded me entirely. He was systematically erasing me from the Crescent Bay narrative, positioning himself as the sole architect of our success. I didn't understand why he was doing it so aggressively, why the erasure had accelerated so suddenly. But I felt it happening, felt my influence diminishing day by day, meeting by meeting. And then our mother announced she was stepping back into a chairman role. Clay would become CEO. His first executive decision 9 days into his tenure was firing me. Standing in that office watching him pack my belongings with obvious satisfaction, I understood something I'd been avoiding for years. Clay didn't just want credit for what we'd built. He wanted me gone. He wanted the story to be exclusively his, with no sister in the background complicating the narrative of his visionary leadership. "You'll receive 8 months severance," he'd said, checking his Rolex. A gift from our mother when he got his MBA. "We're being more than generous. HR has the paperwork ready." 8 months. After 17 years. After turning 3 failing properties into destinations. After building a culture that competitors tried to replicate. After generating the revenue that funded every expansion plan he'd ever pitched. I picked up that box containing my grandmother's photo and my Stanford diploma and 17 years of memories, and I walked out of Crescent Bay headquarters for what I assumed would be the last time. But as I drove away, past the building where I'd spent most of my adult life, I felt something unexpected. Not devastation or anger or grief, though those would come later. What I felt in that moment was cold, clear certainty. Clay had made a catastrophic mistake. And in exactly 10 weeks he was going to discover just how catastrophic it was. The morning after my termination, I woke at 5 a.m. out of pure habit. For 17 years that had been my routine. Check overnight incident reports from all 6 properties. Address any issues before they escalated to guests. Start the day solving problems. My hand reached for my phone automatically, muscle memory expecting the familiar stream of notifications. Nothing. No incident reports. No messages from night managers. No early morning calls about plumbing failures or guest complaints. Just silence. The kind of silence that comes from being erased from something you built with your own hands. I made coffee and sat on my apartment balcony overlooking Santa Monica, watching the sky shift from deep blue to pale gray. Morning joggers passed below, people walking dogs, the ordinary rhythm of life continuing as though my world hadn't just collapsed. A container ship moved slowly across the water in the distance, steady and deliberate, and I found myself envying its simple purpose. Moving from point A to point B with no complications of family or loyalty or betrayal. My phone buzzed at 6:47. A text from Sophia, our director of operations at Monterey. "Blair, I heard what happened. I can't believe it. The new consultants arrived yesterday afternoon and they're already changing everything. They cut the training budget by 40%, said our service standards are excessive, and told housekeeping they can reduce turn-down service to essential rooms only. Staff is devastated. Maria from housekeeping was crying in my office. She's been here 14 years and said she's never been treated like her work doesn't matter. I'm so sorry this happened to you. We're all in shock. Sophia." I stared at the message until the screen went dark, then read it again. Maria. I could picture her exactly. 53 years old, originally from Guatemala, who'd started as a room attendant and worked her way up to housekeeping supervisor through sheer dedication and skill. She took genuine pride in perfect hospital corners and the little origami animals she left on pillows for guests with children. She told me once that her work mattered because she was creating space where people could rest, could feel cared for, could make memories with their families. And now some consultant who'd probably never cleaned a room in his life was telling her that her craftsmanship was excessive. My fingers hovered over the keyboard. Every instinct I had screamed at me to call Sophia immediately, to walk her through how to push back against the consultants, to protect the staff I'd spent years training and valuing. These were my people. I'd hired most of them personally. I'd built a culture where excellence mattered, where staff understood their work had meaning beyond just checking tasks off a list. But I stopped myself. Forced my hands to set the phone down. This wasn't my problem anymore. Clay wanted sole control. He could manage the consequences. I typed back a simple response. Thank you for letting me know. I'm sorry you're dealing with this. No advice. No solutions. No rescue. The message felt inadequate and cold, but it was necessary. I had to let Clay's decisions play out without interference. Still, Sophia's text haunted me. I kept picking up my phone, reading it again, imagining Maria crying in Sophia's office after 14 years of dedicated work. At 11:30, another message arrived. This one from my mother. Lunch today. El Fornaio. 12:30. Il Fornaio was an upscale Italian restaurant in Palo Alto, 2 blocks from our corporate office. We'd eaten there occasionally over the years, usually to discuss business matters my mother didn't want overheard in the office. The location choice wasn't accidental. This wasn't going to be a casual mother-daughter lunch. I arrived exactly on time. Margaret was already seated at a corner table, looking every bit the elegant powerhouse who'd quadrupled our company's value over 3 decades. Her silver hair was perfectly styled, her suit was Armani, her expression was carefully neutral. She'd probably come straight from the office, from the company where I no longer worked, from meetings I'd no longer attend. He told me after he'd already done it, she said the moment I sat down. No greeting, no how are you holding up, just straight to her defense. I would have handled it differently. But you didn't reverse it, I observed quietly. Not an accusation, just a statement of fact. She sighed, touching her water glass without drinking. Clay believes Crescent Bay needs to evolve. Become more corporate, less family-centric in its management structure. And you agree? I asked, though her silence had already answered. I think, she paused, choosing words with the precision of someone who'd navigated corporate politics for 40 years, that your brother has a vision for expansion that the board finds compelling. New markets, new demographics, a more aggressive growth strategy. Our server arrived with menus neither of us needed. Margaret ordered her usual Caesar salad. I ordered the same, though I had no appetite. Some rituals persisted even when everything else was crumbling. After the server left, Margaret's voice dropped lower. The land leases. Clay doesn't fully understand those arrangements. I set down my water glass with deliberate care. The corporate documents explain everything in detail. You know your brother doesn't read legal paperwork unless someone summarizes it for him. She gave me a look that was equal parts maternal concern and business calculation. The renewals come up soon. 10 weeks, I confirmed, meeting her eyes directly. My attorney has been preparing the new terms. My mother went very still. I watched understanding dawn across her features. Understanding mixed with something that looked almost like pride but also concern, maybe even fear about what came next. What are you planning, Blair? The question hung between us in the elegant restaurant. Other diners oblivious to the family drama unfolding over breadsticks and olive oil. Sunlight streamed through the windows, catching the wine glasses and creating small rainbows on the white tablecloth. Everything looked civilized and pleasant on the surface. I'd imagined this conversation for years, if I'm honest. The moment when my careful planning would become visible. When the overlooked daughter would finally have leverage the golden son couldn't match. I'd expected to feel satisfaction, vindication, maybe even triumph. Instead, I felt something more complicated. Sadness mixed with resolve. Love for my mother mixed with cold clarity that family loyalty had only ever gone one direction. Market rate leases, I said finally, my voice steady. Nothing more, nothing less. She nodded slowly, absorbing the implications. That will significantly impact our operating margins. Especially with the Monterey renovation overruns. Yes, I met her gaze without flinching. It will. We ate lunch in weighted silence. The kind that exists between people who understand exactly what's being left unsaid. Margaret had built Crescent Bay from almost nothing. She knew numbers, knew business, knew exactly what market rate leases would do to profitability on 3 flagship properties. She knew I was taking away the financial advantage I'd been giving the company for 4 years. She knew this would hurt. But she wasn't asking me to reconsider. She wasn't apologizing for not reversing Clay's decision. She wasn't acknowledging that maybe, just maybe, firing your daughter after 17 years of loyal service wasn't the visionary leadership the board should be celebrating. As we finished eating, she reached across the table and took my hand. A rare gesture of physical affection from a woman who'd built an empire by being tough more often than tender. Your brother sees business as a competition to win, she said softly. You've always seen it as something to build and protect. Don't lose that part of yourself whatever happens next. I wanted to ask what she thought was going to happen. I wanted to ask if she'd known Clay was planning to fire me, if she'd encouraged it or just failed to stop it. I wanted to ask how she could sit there offering me wisdom about not losing myself when she'd just chosen my brother's ambition over my loyalty. But I didn't ask any of those questions. Because I already knew the answers and hearing them spoken aloud wouldn't change anything. I watched her walk back to her car, back to the office, back to Clay and the board and the company we'd built together. Her shoulders were straight, her stride confident, every inch the businesswoman who'd never let sentiment interfere with strategy. And I understood something with absolute clarity. I was truly on my own now. No mother to appeal to, no brother to reason with, no family safety net to catch me. Whatever happened next, I'd be navigating it alone. The realization should have terrified me. Instead, it felt almost liberating. That afternoon, instead of wallowing in self-pity or sending out job applications, I made a single phone call. To Rebecca Lansing, an old colleague who'd left Crescent Bay 5 years ago to start her own boutique hospitality consulting firm. I heard, Rebecca said the moment she answered, not bothering with pleasantries. The industry is already talking. Clay's making moves that don't make sense to people who actually understand operations. I need information, I said directly. Discreetly. What kind of information? The kind that explains why my brother was so eager to get rid of me right now, specifically. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Then, you think this isn't just about ego? You think he needed you gone for a specific reason? Exactly. Give me a few days, Rebecca said. If Clay's up to something, I'll find it. After we hung up, I stood at my apartment window watching the Pacific. The water was dark gray today, choppy with whitecaps, restless. A storm was coming in from the north, the weather forecast said. Heavy rain by evening. I thought about my grandmother's compass, now sitting in a box of belongings from my office. She'd used that compass to navigate California's coast looking for opportunities nobody else saw. She'd built something from nothing through determination and vision and the willingness to take risks when everyone said she was crazy. I was her granddaughter. I'd inherited more than just her compass. 3 days later, Rebecca called back. And what she told me made everything suddenly terribly clear. You need to sit down for this, Rebecca said when she called back 3 days later. I was already sitting, but I understood what she meant. Her tone carried the weight of information that would change everything. I pulled my laptop closer, ready to take notes, and waited. Blair, your brother has been building a competing resort company for the past 2 years. It's called Summit Coastal Collection. The words didn't make sense at first. I heard them, but my brain couldn't process the meaning. Competing company? While running Crescent Bay. What do you mean, competing? I asked slowly. I mean he's filed LLC paperwork under shell companies. Used his wife's maiden name and various business partners' names to keep it hidden. He's secured preliminary development permits for luxury resort properties in Santa Barbara, Carmel, and Newport Beach. My stomach dropped. Those were the exact markets where Crescent Bay had approved expansion plans. I'd been in the confidential board meetings where we'd discussed those locations, analyzed the demographics, evaluated the competitive landscape. Clay had been in those same meetings, taking notes, asking questions, stealing our strategy. There's more, Rebecca continued, and I could hear her flipping through papers. I managed to get a copy of his pitch deck through an investor contact. Blair, it's 47 pages of detailed business plans. And it explicitly describes, I'm reading this directly, leveraging 17 years of operational expertise and established client relationships developed at Crescent Bay Resort Group to capture market share in underserved luxury coastal markets. 17 years. My 17 years. He's using our operational data, Rebecca said. Guest demographic analysis, service protocols, training methodologies. Everything you developed. He's presenting Crescent Bay's weaknesses, things only an insider would know, as market opportunities his new brand will exploit. I stood up and walked to my balcony, needing air. The Pacific stretched out before me, indifferent to human betrayal, constant and unchanging. A family of 4 was setting up on the beach below, the parents spreading out towels while their kids ran toward the water. Normal people living normal lives without brothers who committed corporate espionage. How long have you known about this? I asked, my voice surprisingly steady. I started getting fragments about 3 days ago. But I wanted to confirm everything before calling you. There's more. He's been recruiting Crescent Bay staff. What? At least 8 key employees have signed preliminary agreements with Summit Coastal. They're being offered equity positions contingent on leaving Crescent Bay within the next 6 months and bringing their client relationships with them. Some of them are your people, managers you personally hired and trained. I thought about Sophia's text about the consultants cutting training budgets and telling housekeeping their standards were excessive. I thought about Maria crying in Sophia's office. Now it made horrifying sense. Clay wasn't just cutting costs. He was deliberately degrading the properties, making them less valuable, while simultaneously building a competing brand that would poach our best staff and our operational expertise. He needed you gone, Rebecca said quietly. You're the only person at Crescent Bay who actually understands operations well enough to notice what he was doing. You'd have spotted the staff recruitment, questioned the strategic decisions that didn't make sense, reviewed the permits and licensing. He couldn't build Summit Coastal with you watching. I closed my eyes, feeling the last piece of sibling affection dissolve completely. This wasn't about Clay thinking he could run the company better without me. This wasn't about ego or ambition or even family dysfunction. This was calculated theft. He'd spent 2 years planning to steal everything I'd built, rebrand it as his own achievement, and destroy our family's company in the process. Thank you, Rebecca, I said. Can you send me everything you found? Already in your email. Blair, I'm sorry. I know he's your brother. He was my brother, I corrected. Now he's just someone who made a very big mistake. After we hung up, I spent 2 hours reading through every document Rebecca had sent. The LLC filings. The development permits. The pitch deck with its glossy photos and stolen data. The staff recruitment contracts with their knowledge transfer requirements. Each page made me angrier and strangely calmer. Because now I understood exactly what I was dealing with. I was about to send the files to my attorney when my phone rang again. Unknown San Francisco number. Ms. Hartwick? This is Marcus Webb. I'm on the Crescent Bay board. I knew who Marcus was. One of Clay's business school friends, someone I'd assumed was completely in my brother's pocket. I need you to know something, he said without pleasantries. And I need you to know I'm calling against Clay's interests, which should tell you something about how serious this is. I'm listening. I joined your family's board because I respected your mother's vision and your operational track record. Clay told us you were leaving voluntarily. He said you were burned out, that you wanted to pursue independent consulting, that it was an amicable transition. We thought we were supporting a graceful exit. That's not what happened, I said flatly. I'm realizing that now. I've seen your lease renewal terms. Market rate instead of the preferential rates you'd been giving the company. That got me asking questions about why you'd make that change. And then I heard rumors about something called Summit Coastal Collection. They're not rumors, I said. I have documentation. There was a long pause. Clay lied to us, Marcus said, and he sounded genuinely angry. He lied about your departure and now I understand why. There's a board meeting scheduled for tomorrow afternoon. He's going to propose that Crescent Bay sell the Monterey, Big Sur, and Laguna Beach properties. My hand tightened on the phone. On what grounds? He'll argue that your new lease terms make them financially unviable. That we should sell quickly to minimize losses before the market realizes they're struggling. He's already got a valuation firm preparing analysis that will show the properties are worth less than they actually are. The final piece clicked into place with devastating clarity. Clay wanted Crescent Bay to sell the properties at distressed prices. Then Summit Coastal, probably through straw buyers or friendly investors, would acquire them. He'd operate the resorts I'd built while paying me rent for the land, all while destroying the family business our grandmother founded. It was brilliant and sociopathic in equal measure. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked Marcus. "Because I don't like being lied to. And because what Clay's doing isn't just unethical, it's potentially illegal. He's using his position as CEO to advantage a competing business he secretly owns. That's a breach of fiduciary duty at minimum, possibly corporate espionage depending on what proprietary information he's used." "Thank you for calling," I said. "I appreciate your integrity. What are you going to do?" "I'm not sure yet," I lied. I knew exactly what I was going to do. After Marcus hung up, I sat very still thinking through options. I could attend the board meeting tomorrow, present the evidence of Summit Coastal, expose Clay's betrayal publicly. That would feel satisfying. It would also give him time to prepare a defense, to spin the narrative, to potentially destroy evidence. Or I could do something different. Something strategic. I pulled up my contacts and found a name I hadn't called in 3 years. Catherine Winters, CEO of Pacific Luxury Group. We'd met at a hospitality industry conference, and she tried to recruit me for a senior operations role. I'd declined out of family loyalty, the same loyalty that had gotten me fired and betrayed. Her assistant answered, and I was surprised when Catherine came on the line personally within 2 minutes. "Blair Hartwick," she said warmly. "I heard about what happened at Crescent Bay. The industry is buzzing." "News travels fast," I said. "In hospitality it always does. Especially when someone with your reputation gets pushed out by someone with significantly less operational expertise. What can I do for you?" I appreciated that she didn't pretend not to know the details or offer false sympathy. "I need a meeting. Today if possible. And I need it to stay completely confidential. I have an opening at 3. My office in San Francisco. I'll be there." Catherine's office was everything Clay's had been and mine never was. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Bay Bridge, custom furniture, original artwork. The kind of space designed to impress and intimidate. But Catherine herself was surprisingly approachable, mid-50s with sharp eyes and a directness I immediately appreciated. "So," she said once we were seated with coffee, "I heard Crescent Bay might be selling some properties." 3 properties, I confirmed. They're most profitable ones. There's a board meeting tomorrow where my brother will propose the sales. "And you own the land beneath those properties," Catherine said. It wasn't a question. "You've done your homework." "I always do." "So what are you proposing, Blair?" I slid the portfolio across her desk. Everything I'd spent the past 3 hours preparing. Financial data, operational metrics, guest satisfaction scores, staff retention statistics, market analysis. And my proposal. Pacific Luxury acquires the buildings when Crescent Bay sells them. I maintain land ownership but offer preferential lease terms significantly below market rate. And Pacific Luxury commits to retaining all current staff with improved benefits. Catherine reviewed the materials in silence. She had the kind of focus that reminded me of my grandmother, seeing past surface details to underlying value. "Why not just raise the rent and keep collecting checks?" she asked finally. "You'd make more money with less work." "Because my brother is planning to acquire the properties himself through his competing brand," I explained. "I'd rather choose my business partners than be stuck with someone who spent 2 years stealing from me." "Competing brand?" Catherine's eyebrows rose. I showed her Rebecca's file on Summit Coastal Collection. Watched her expression shift from surprise to understanding to something like respect. "That's audacious," she said. "And stupid. Using proprietary information while serving as CEO? That's corporate suicide if anyone finds out." "Someone is about to find out," I said. "But I'd prefer the discovery happens after I've secured the future of the properties and the staff I built them with. Pacific Luxury has a reputation for maintaining quality standards and valuing employees during acquisitions. That matters to me more than maximum profit." Catherine studied me for a long moment. "Family businesses are complicated," she said finally. "This isn't about family anymore," I replied. "It's about protecting what I built from someone who was willing to destroy it for his own gain." She smiled slightly. "Let's build something better." Catherine's legal team moved with impressive speed. Within 48 hours of our meeting, I received a draft acquisition proposal that was more comprehensive than anything I could have created myself. The terms exceeded current market value for the properties despite the operational challenges Clay's decisions were creating. Catherine understood something my brother never had. My true value wasn't just land ownership. It was the institutional knowledge, the staff relationships, the operational expertise that would take years for any outside buyer to replicate. But speed created its own problem. While attorneys drafted contracts and conducted due diligence, real people were suffering under Clay's mismanagement. I kept getting texts from staff, not asking for help directly but sharing their frustration and confusion. The consultants had eliminated our artisan bread supplier in favor of frozen rolls from a national distributor. They'd cut our signature turn-down service entirely, calling it redundant. They'd reduced housekeeping staff to the point where deep cleaning was impossible, just surface maintenance. I faced a choice: stay silent and let Clay's incompetence play out, or quietly reassure the people I'd built Crescent Bay with that someone was watching, that their loyalty to quality would matter. I compromised. I called Sophia first, using my personal cell to her personal cell, a Thursday evening when I knew she'd be home from Monterey. "Blair," she answered, her voice a mixture of relief and caution. I wasn't sure if I should reach out again. "I need you to do something for me," I said directly. "And I need you to trust me without me being able to explain everything yet." "Okay." No hesitation, and that trust meant everything. Document everything the consultants are changing. Every cut to service standards, every policy that contradicts what we built, every guest complaint that results from their decisions. Keep detailed records with dates and specifics. It will matter soon. There was a pause. "Blair, are you?" "I can't say more right now. But Sophia, your job is safe. More than safe. Trust me for a few more weeks." I could hear her exhale. "I knew you wouldn't just abandon us. I told Maria that. I told everyone." After we hung up, I made similar calls to Tom, our head of operations at Big Sur, and Alicia, the front desk manager at Laguna Beach. 3 more key people who'd been with me for years, who understood what we'd built, who were watching it crumble under Clay's arrogance. I never explicitly mentioned Pacific Luxury or the acquisition strategy, but I made sure they knew someone was watching, someone cared, someone would act. These conversations violated the clean separation Clay had imposed. But I didn't care. These people had built something meaningful alongside me, and I wouldn't abandon them while corporate chess games played out. 3 weeks after my termination, California Coastal Properties, a respected industry trade publication, ran a piece that changed everything. I was having coffee on my balcony when Sophia forwarded me the link with a single word: "Wow." The headline read, "Crescent Bay Resort Group faces operational challenges amid leadership transition." I read through it carefully. The article noted declining guest satisfaction scores at 3 flagship properties, increased staff turnover, and rumors of strategic restructuring, potentially involving asset sales. It mentioned that Pacific Luxury Group, known for acquiring distressed coastal properties and returning them to profitability, had expressed interest in prime California coastal assets currently undergoing operational transitions. The article never named me directly, but anyone in our industry would connect the dots immediately. The operational backbone had been removed, properties were declining, and a respected competitor was circling. The timeline was too specific to be coincidental. My phone rang within an hour. "Margaret, did you see the article?" she asked without preamble. "I did. Clay is furious. He thinks you're behind it." "I didn't speak to any journalists," I said truthfully. I hadn't needed to. The industry was watching, drawing their own conclusions from observable facts. He sent a company-wide email denying everything. But Blair, the board rejected his proposal to sell the properties this morning. They want more information about the operational challenges before making any divestiture decisions. I sipped my coffee, watching a pelican dive for fish in the surf below. "That sounds prudent." "He knows you've been meeting with Pacific Luxury," Margaret said quietly. "He hired someone to follow you." That should have alarmed me, but instead I almost laughed. Clay was so convinced that everything was about him, about attacks and competition and corporate warfare. It hadn't occurred to him that maybe I was just building something new, protecting people he'd hurt, creating value that didn't revolve around him at all. "What are you trying to accomplish?" Margaret asked, and I heard genuine confusion in her voice. "I'm protecting what I built," I said simply. The same way you taught me to. She was silent for a long moment. The board wants answers. About the properties, about the lease arrangements, about what's actually happening operationally. Then they should ask someone who actually knows operations, I said. Oh wait, they fired her. I regretted the sharpness immediately, but Margaret just sighed. You're right. We did. And I'm watching Clay discover what we lost. 2 days later, Sophia called with information that shifted everything again. Blair, something happened yesterday that you need to know about. Clay held a meeting with department heads at Monterey. He was reviewing financial reports when his attorney pointed something out. Apparently, they just discovered that the land payments we've been making for 4 years, they've been going to you. I'd been expecting this discovery eventually, but the timing surprised me. And Clay completely lost it. Started yelling about hidden conflicts of interest and corporate manipulation. He called an emergency board meeting for this afternoon. He's arguing that you've been secretly positioning yourself to sabotage the company. The payments are all documented in the corporate financial reports, I said calmly. Every board member has received them annually for 4 years. That's what Marcus Webb said. He interrupted Clay and pointed out that if Clay hadn't read the financial disclosures, that was his failure, not your deception. Blair was brutal. Clay's credibility with the board is falling apart. After Sophia hung up, I sat very still, thinking through implications. Clay was panicking, making mistakes, attacking me publicly. Which meant he was desperate. Which meant he knew his plans were unraveling but couldn't see the full picture yet. My phone buzzed with a text from Rebecca. Call me. No. Found something big. I called immediately. Blair, I found the recruitment contracts, Rebecca said without preamble. Clay has signed agreements with 8 key Crescent Bay employees offering them equity positions in Summit Coastal Collection. I knew he was recruiting staff, I said. You told me that already. But I didn't have the actual contracts before. Now I do. And Blair, they're explicit. The employment offers are contingent on the employees leaving Crescent Bay within 6 months and bringing their client relationships with them. The contracts require them to share operational knowledge, guest preferences, service protocols, everything they developed at Crescent Bay. My hand tightened on the phone. That's not just poaching staff. That's industrial espionage, Rebecca finished. Exactly. One of the attorneys approached to review these contracts had ethical concerns about the knowledge transfer requirements. He reached out through our network because he knew my history with Crescent Bay. He wanted someone to know what was happening. Send me everything, I said. Within an hour I had the complete picture. Clay's competing resort brand with its stolen strategic markets. The development permits filed while he was serving as COO and CO. The pitch deck with proprietary operational data I'd developed. The staff recruitment contracts with their knowledge transfer requirements. The plan to force Crescent Bay to sell properties at distressed prices so Summit Coastal could acquire them. It wasn't business competition. It wasn't even aggressive entrepreneurship. It was systematic theft of 17 years of my work, disguised as visionary leadership. I forwarded everything to Marcus Webb with a simple message. I think the board should see what they're actually dealing with before making any decisions about property sales. Marcus called back within an hour. His voice was tight with controlled anger. I've reviewed everything you sent. This is worse than I thought. Much worse. Yes, I said simply. We need to have another board meeting. A real one with complete information. And Blair, you need to be there. I looked out at the Pacific thinking about my grandmother's compass, about foundations and facades, about the difference between what looked impressive and what actually mattered. I'll be there, I said. But I'm not coming to defend myself. I'm coming to present facts. What the board does with those facts is their decision. Fair enough, Marcus said. Meeting is scheduled for next Tuesday. 2 o'clock. After we hung up, I felt something unexpected settle in my chest. Not satisfaction or vindication, but clarity. For 17 years I'd built something real while Clay built a reputation. Now we'd both be measured by what we'd actually created versus what we'd claimed. And I was no longer afraid of that comparison. The weekend before the board meeting, I did something I hadn't done in years. I turned off my phone and went for a long drive up the coast. I needed to think without interruption, to prepare mentally for what was coming, to make peace with the fact that I was about to destroy my brother's career. I drove north past Malibu, past Ventura, all the way to the property in Big Sur. I didn't go inside, I just sat in my car in the overlook parking area, watching the Pacific crash against the rocks below. This was one of the properties I'd transformed, one of the places where I'd spent countless hours working with staff perfecting details, building something that mattered. Clay wanted to steal it, rebrand it, claim it as his own creation. I thought about my grandmother, about that compass she'd used to scout locations. About how she'd built something from nothing through grit and integrity. About how she'd never taken shortcuts or stolen credit or betrayed people who trusted her. I pulled out my phone and turned it back on. 17 missed calls, most from numbers I didn't recognize. But one was from my mother, time-stamped at 11:47 p.m. the night before. There was a voicemail. I almost deleted it without listening. But something in the timestamp, nearly midnight on a Saturday, made me press play. Blair. My mother's voice was shaking in a way I'd never heard. I didn't know. I swear I didn't know about Summit Coastal. Marcus sent the complete file to all board members yesterday. I've spent the evening reading through everything and her voice broke. Call me. Please. I sat there for a long moment watching seabirds circle over the water. Then I called her back. She answered on the first ring. Blair. I got your message. He used information from board meetings, she said without preamble, her voice raw with something between anger and grief. Markets we decided on in executive sessions. Financial projections from private discussions. Development permits filed in cities we'd identified as expansion targets. He's been stealing from us while I defended his vision, while I told you he needed space to lead. I remained silent, letting her work through it. I chose him over you, Margaret continued, and now I could hear she was crying. You warned me 4 years ago about vulnerabilities. You protected us by buying that land. You've been saving this company while he's been planning to destroy it. And I defended him when he fired you. I told you he had vision, that you should trust his leadership. The silence between us stretched, carrying decades of family dynamics I'd never fully articulated. Me being the dependable one while Clay was the favored one. Execution being valued less than vision. Daughters being asked to support their brother's ambitions rather than build their own. Mom, I said finally, my voice gentle but firm. You taught me to protect myself. You warned me about Clay 4 years ago. Told me he saw businesses as trophies to win. Told me to safeguard my own future. On some level you knew this could happen. You just hoped it wouldn't. Her silence confirmed what we both understood. She'd seen Clay's selfishness, his willingness to take credit for others' work, his view of business as something to conquer rather than build. She'd warned me to protect myself precisely because she'd feared this moment. But when it came, she'd still chosen to believe in his vision over my loyalty. What happens now? She asked quietly. That depends, I replied, on whether the board wants to protect Crescent Bay or protect Clay. They can't be the same thing anymore, can they? No, I said. They can't. We talked for another hour, the longest real conversation we'd had in years. Margaret told me about finding the staff recruitment contracts, about realizing Clay had been planning this betrayal for 2 years while sitting in family dinners, while accepting her guidance, while letting her believe they were building something together. She told me she felt like she didn't know her own son, and I didn't have the heart to tell her that maybe she'd never really known him at all. When we finally hung up, I sat in my car watching the sunset paint the Pacific in shades of orange and gold. Then I drove back to Santa Monica and spent the rest of the weekend preparing for Tuesday's meeting. Catherine's team had been working around the clock. The acquisition proposal they drafted was comprehensive. Financial terms that exceeded market value, staff retention guarantees with improved benefits, commitments to maintain service standards, even profit-sharing programs for property-level management. It was the kind of deal that protected people, not just assets. My own attorney had prepared something equally thorough. A presentation documenting Clay's betrayal with the kind of detail that left no room for interpretation. Side-by-side comparisons of Crescent Bay's confidential strategic plans and Summit Coastal's development permits. Excerpts from Clay's pitch deck showing proprietary operational data. The staff recruitment contracts with their knowledge transfer requirements. A timeline showing exactly when each piece of betrayal had occurred. I also had operational reports showing the damage Clay's management was causing in real time. Guest satisfaction scores dropping from 95% to 73% in just 6 weeks. Staff turnover up 35%. Online reviews mentioning declining service standards, dirty rooms, indifferent staff. Revenue projections showing the properties would become unprofitable within 18 months if current management continued. The evidence was devastating, methodical, irrefutable. Catherine reviewed everything Monday afternoon in her office. When she finished, she looked at me with something like respect mixed with concern. "This isn't revenge, Blair," she said carefully. "This is accountability." "It's both," I admitted. "I'm protecting people and principles I care about. But I'm also making sure Clay faces consequences for what he's done." "He's your brother." "He was my brother," I corrected. "Now he's just someone who made a catastrophic mistake and is about to discover the cost." That night I stood on my balcony one last time before the meeting, thinking about everything that had brought me here. I thought about my grandmother founding our first property with nothing but determination and a compass. About my mother building an empire through shrewd decisions. About 17 years of my life poured into creating something excellent. About Clay systematically trying to steal it all. And I thought about the staff, Maria and Sophia and Tom and Alicia and all the others who'd built Crescent Bay alongside me, who were watching standards crumble, who deserved better than a CEO who saw them as expendable. This wasn't just about me anymore. It never had been. Tuesday morning arrived clear and cold. I dressed carefully, not the operational casual I'd worn for 17 years, but a suit that meant business. Professional, polished, ready. Walking into the Crescent Bay boardroom felt surreal. I hadn't been in this space since Clay fired me 6 weeks ago. The room looked exactly the same, the long mahogany table, the leather chairs, the windows overlooking Palo Alto, but everything felt different. Clay sat at the head of the table where our mother used to sit, his face already tight with defensive anger. He'd clearly prepared for battle. Margaret sat to his right, looking older and smaller than I'd ever seen her. The other board members filled the remaining seats, their expressions carefully neutral. I took a seat at the opposite end, placed my portfolio in front of me and waited. Clay opened immediately, his voice sharp. "Let's be clear about what's happening here. My sister is attempting corporate manipulation through backdoor dealing, leveraging land ownership she acquired under questionable circumstances to sabotage this company's leadership and my authority as CEO." "Incorrect," I replied calmly, meeting his eyes directly. "I'm exercising my rights as a property owner. And I'm providing this board with information they need to make informed decisions about Crescent Bay's future." I slid folders to each board member with deliberate care. These documents show that while serving as COO and then CEO of Crescent Bay, Clay has been secretly developing Summit Coastal Collection, a competing luxury resort brand targeting markets we identified in confidential strategic sessions, using operational data and service protocols developed at Crescent Bay, and recruiting our best staff with equity offers contingent on them transferring proprietary knowledge to his competing business. The room went absolutely silent. Board members opened their folders, and I watched their expressions shift from curiosity to shock to anger as they processed what they were seeing. Marcus Webb spoke first, his voice controlled but tight. "Clay, these development permits are dated while you were serving as COO. They're filed in Santa Barbara, Carmel, and Newport Beach, the exact markets we discussed and approved in executive session strategic planning. Markets where we allocated budget for feasibility studies. How do you explain having permits for competing properties in those locations?" Clay's face flushed. "Business people explore multiple opportunities. Summit Coastal is completely separate from Crescent Bay. There's no conflict of interest in pursuing my own entrepreneurial ventures outside of my responsibilities here. Even when those ventures explicitly plan to compete with the company you're leading?" I asked quietly. "Even when your pitch deck, which is in the folder in front of you, describes leveraging Crescent Bay's operational knowledge and client relationships. Even when you're recruiting our staff with contracts requiring them to share proprietary information they developed while working for us. You don't understand business, Blair," Clay snapped, and I heard the same dismissive tone he'd used when firing me. "You never have. This is how industries work. Knowledge isn't owned by one company. Intellectual property actually is owned," Marcus interrupted, his patience clearly exhausted. "And fiduciary duty requires you to prioritize this company's interests while serving as CEO. You've violated both. Systematically and deliberately." Jennifer Park, a board member who'd initially supported Clay's aggressive growth strategy, was reading through the pitch deck with visible anger. "Clay, this presentation is dated 3 months ago. You'd already secured $14 million in private equity funding. You'd filed development permits in 3 cities. This isn't exploring opportunities. This is an operational competing business you were building while drawing your CEO's salary from Crescent Bay and using our confidential strategic information." Another board member held up the recruitment contracts. "These employment offers are contingent on staff bringing client relationships and operational knowledge from Crescent Bay. That's not networking. That's industrial espionage." Clay tried one last defense, his voice rising. "She's manipulating all of you. She bought that land specifically to create this leverage to position herself to attack me." 4 years ago, Marcus cut him off. "Blair bought that land 4 years ago to protect Crescent Bay from external threats. You fired her 6 weeks ago after systematically excluding her from decisions for 18 months. Her defensive preparation isn't the problem here, Clay. Your betrayal is." I watched my brother's confidence crumble in real time, watched him realize that no amount of charm or spin could overcome documented evidence. His explanations became desperate, contradictory, increasingly panicked. The board voted unanimously to accept Pacific Luxury's acquisition proposal. 1 abstention. Margaret, who sat motionless, staring at her son with an expression I couldn't read. They also voted to request Clay's immediate resignation and initiate a formal investigation into Summit Coastal's use of Crescent Bay's proprietary information. Clay stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "You're all making a mistake. I built this company." "No," I said quietly, standing to face him across the table. "Grandmother built this company. Mom grew it. I ran it. You took credit for it. There's a difference, Clay. You just couldn't see it until it was too late." He stared at me for a long moment and I saw something flicker across his face. Shock that I'd fought back, rage that I'd won, maybe even the first hint of understanding about what he'd actually done. Then he stormed out, slamming the door hard enough to rattle the glass walls. In the silence that followed, I felt not triumph but something more complicated. Exhaustion mixed with grief, relief mixed with sadness. I just destroyed my brother's career to save everything else. It was necessary. It was painful. And nothing would ever be the same. After the board meeting, I sat in my car in the Crescent Bay parking lot for 20 minutes, unable to move. My hands were shaking, my heart was racing, and I felt simultaneously exhausted and wired. I just destroyed my brother's career. It had been necessary, justified, backed by irrefutable evidence. But that didn't make it feel any less like I'd detonated a bomb in the center of my family. Marcus Webb found me there. He knocked on my window gently and I rolled it down. "You okay?" he asked. "I don't know," I answered honestly. "What you did in there took courage. The board needed to see the truth." "I know. But he's still my brother. Or he was." Marcus nodded with understanding. "Catherine Winters called me an hour ago. Pacific Luxury's legal team is ready to move forward immediately if you are. The transition can start within the week." I looked back at the building where I'd spent 17 years of my life. Where I'd built something I was proud of. Where my brother had tried to erase me and steal everything I'd created. "Let's start Monday," I said. The next 2 weeks were a blur of legal documents, operational assessments and staff meetings. Catherine officially brought me on as Director of Coastal Operations for Pacific Luxury, giving me authority to oversee the acquisition transition for all 3 properties. The title felt strange at first. For 17 years I'd never had a title that reflected what I actually did. I'd just been operations, invisible and essential in equal measure. Now I had real authority. Real resources. Real support. But my first priority wasn't paperwork or financial analysis. It was people. I drove to Monterey on a Thursday morning, arriving before the breakfast service ended. Sophia was in her office reviewing room status reports when I knocked on her door. "Blair." She stood immediately and I saw relief flood her features. "I heard about the board meeting. Everyone's heard rumors, but nobody knows what's really happening. Can we talk?" "Privately." We went to the empty conference room overlooking the bay. Morning sunlight streamed through the windows, catching the water and making everything sparkle. This had been one of my favorite spaces when I'd worked here, A place where I'd trained new managers and planned renovations and dreamed about what these properties could become. Pacific Luxury is acquiring Monterey, Big Sur and Laguna Beach, I said directly. The transition will be complete within 60 days. And Sophia, I need you to know, your job is not just safe. It's valued. Pacific Luxury is committed to restoring the service standards we built, with better resources and support than we ever had at Crescent Bay. Sophia's eyes filled with tears. I knew you wouldn't abandon us. When you called and told me to document everything the consultants were changing, I knew you had a plan. You kept the standards alive when Clay's people were trying to destroy them, I said. That mattered. That's why we can recover so quickly now. We talked for another hour. I explained the acquisition terms, the staff retention guarantees, the improved benefit packages. I answered her questions honestly, acknowledged the chaos she'd endured, validated the pain of watching something we'd built get dismantled by people who didn't understand what made it special. There's something else, I said as we were finishing. Pacific Luxury offers profit-sharing programs for property-level management. You'll have actual ownership stake in the success you create. Not just a salary and a thank you, real financial participation. Sophia cried then properly. Not sad tears but overwhelmed ones. In 14 years at Crescent Bay, I never felt like Clay saw my work. He'd visit properties for photo opportunities with VIP guests, but he never asked about operations, never wanted to understand what actually made things run. I know, I said quietly. I lived that too. I had similar conversations that week with Tom at Big Sur and Alicia at Laguna Beach. With Maria, the housekeeping supervisor who'd been told her meticulous work was excessive. With James, the maintenance director who'd been forced to defer repairs to meet budget cuts. With every key staff member who'd built these properties alongside me. Each conversation was personal, honest, and necessary. I acknowledged what they'd endured, validated their expertise, and made concrete commitments about what came next. Not corporate speak or vague promises, but specific details about how their work lives would improve. Catherine attended several of these meetings, observing but rarely speaking. Afterward, over coffee at a cafe overlooking the Monterey Pier, she said something that surprised me. I've acquired 12 properties in my career, Blair. I've never seen anything like how your people respond to you. They don't just respect you, they believe in you. You didn't just manage them. You built a culture they were willing to fight for. They believed in what we were building together, I said. That's different than believing in me. No, Catherine shook her head. They believed in you. Because you believed in them first. That's what we're really acquiring here. Not just real estate and operational systems, but a culture of excellence that can't be replicated by consultants or purchased with capital. The operational improvements came quickly once staff had leadership they trusted. Service standards were restored within the first month. Training programs resumed. The consultants Clay had brought in were dismissed, and their cost-cutting measures were reversed. Guest satisfaction scores began climbing back toward where they'd been before my termination. But emotional recovery took longer. Staff needed time to believe the chaos was actually over, that the new leadership wouldn't disappear or change their minds, that they could invest emotionally in their work again without fear of having it devalued. 3 weeks after the acquisition began, my mother called and asked if I'd come to her house in Carmel. Not for a business meeting or a tense lunch in a public restaurant, but to her home. The first time she'd invited me there since Clay fired me. I almost said no. But something in her voice, a vulnerability I wasn't used to hearing, made me agree. Saturday afternoon, I drove to Carmel and pulled up to the house where I'd spent countless family dinners and holiday gatherings. The terrace where she'd warned me 4 years ago to protect myself. The living room where Clay had opened Christmas presents while I'd helped in the kitchen. The memories felt heavy like artifacts from someone else's life. Margaret was waiting on the terrace, 2 glasses of wine already poured. She looked older than I'd ever seen her, thinner with new lines around her eyes and gray showing at her roots that she hadn't bothered to cover. We sat in silence for a moment looking out at the Pacific. I owe you an apology that can't be adequately expressed, she began finally, her voice careful and formal. I enabled Clay's worst qualities by constantly making excuses for him. I told myself his vision justified his flaws, that your execution would balance his ambition. I saw what he was becoming and instead of addressing it, I warned you to protect yourself. I sipped my wine and waited. When he fired you, I told myself it was a business decision, she continued, struggling with honesty. I didn't reverse it because I wanted to believe he could succeed without you. That would have validated everything I'd told myself about his potential, about grooming him for leadership. She looked out at the ocean and I saw tears on her cheeks, the first time I'd witnessed my mother cry since my father's death 15 years ago. I chose my son's ambition over my daughter's loyalty, she said quietly. I sacrificed you to protect my vision of what Clay could become. And I'm sorry, Blair. I'm so sorry. The apology was real and painful and incomplete. Because she was apologizing for the acute betrayal, not reversing Clay's decision, but not for the 17 years of chronic favoritism that had made that betrayal possible. Not for positioning Clay as vision while I was execution. Not for years of family dinners where his strategic initiatives mattered more than my operational updates. Not for grooming him for leadership while teaching me to be indispensable in ways that ultimately made me disposable. Mom, I said carefully, I appreciate the apology. I do. But I need you to understand, this wasn't just about Clay firing me. It was about 17 years of being treated as the infrastructure that made his success possible. Of watching you position him as the future while I was positioned as the foundation. You taught me to be excellent at being undervalued. She nodded slowly, absorbing the truth. You're right. And I don't know how to fix that. You can't fix it, I said. You can only acknowledge it and do better going forward. We talked for 2 more hours, the most honest conversation we'd had in decades. She told me about the guilt of watching Clay's betrayal unfold, about finding the Summit Coastal files and realizing her son had been lying to her face for 2 years. She told me about stepping down from Crescent Bay's board entirely because she couldn't bear watching what remained of the company. I told her about the pain of invisibility, about watching Clay take credit for my work, about the slow erosion of being valued but not recognized, about building something extraordinary and having your own family dismiss you from it. Can we rebuild? She asked as the sun started setting. Maybe, I said honestly. But it has to be real this time. No more favoring one child's ambition over the other's contributions. No more asking me to minimize my hurt to preserve family harmony. Real or nothing. Real, she agreed. We started having dinner once a week after that. Not at restaurants but at her house, just the 2 of us. Slowly, carefully, we built something different than what we'd had before. Not the easy relationship of mother and daughter who'd never disappointed each other, but the harder relationship of 2 people who'd hurt each other and were choosing to acknowledge it. 2 months after the board meeting, Rebecca called with news I'd been half expecting. Summit Coastal is dissolving, she said. The investors discovered Clay's pitch deck contained proprietary information from Crescent Bay. They've withdrawn all funding and are threatening legal action. Clay's trying to negotiate settlements to avoid criminal charges. I sat very still, phone pressed to my ear. Where is he now? Moving to Arizona, apparently. Taking some position in commercial real estate. Completely different industry. After we hung up, I stood on my balcony and cried. Not for Clay's consequences, he'd earned those through his own choices. But for the brother I'd once had before ambition poisoned him. For the family we might have been if he'd valued loyalty more than trophies. For the sister I'd been who'd believed that working hard and building something excellent would be enough. That version of me was gone. And grieving her felt necessary. 4 months after my termination, I stood on the infinity pool deck at Grandview Coast, the property formerly known as Monterey, watching the sunset paint the Pacific in shades of amber and gold. The renovation we'd started under Clay's mismanagement was finally complete. Executed properly this time with adequate budget and skilled contractors and my direct oversight. The property was beautiful. More than that, it was excellent in ways that mattered. Service standards that guests noticed, staff who took pride in their work, operational systems that functioned seamlessly. Sophia found me there, tablet in hand. Latest guest satisfaction scores just came in. 96%. Highest in the region. I smiled, feeling something I hadn't felt in months. Not vindication or revenge, but genuine pride untangled from family complication. You built something remarkable, Blair, Sophia said. We built it, I corrected. And we're building it again. Better this time. As autumn deepened into winter, I found myself facing the first major holiday season without family traditions. Thanksgiving had always meant my mother's caramel house. the formal dining room set with her grandmother's china, extended family gathered around the table, Clay holding court while I helped in the kitchen. For 39 years that had been the rhythm of November. This year Margaret invited me to her weekly dinner on Thanksgiving. A quiet meal, just the two of us. I almost accepted out of habit, but then I imagined sitting at that table where so many family decisions had been made without my input, where my contributions had been summarized in quick operational updates, while Clay's vision received hours of discussion. "I'm not ready yet," I told her on the phone. "I need more time." "I understand," she said, though I heard disappointment in her voice. "What will you do?" "Work," I said simply. And I did. I drove to Grandview Coast on Thanksgiving morning and spent the day with staff preparing for what would be our busiest weekend of the year. I checked kitchen prep with our head chef, reviewed room assignments with housekeeping, walked the property looking for anything that didn't meet standards. It wasn't traditional, but it felt honest. These were people who valued my work, who understood what I'd built, who didn't treat my expertise as supporting infrastructure for someone else's vision. Sophia found me on the terrace around sunset, overseeing the setup for evening service. "You're spending Thanksgiving with us," she observed. "You're spending it working too," I pointed out. "Because I love this place. Because it matters." She paused. "That's why you're here too, isn't it? This is your family now." I didn't correct her because she was right in ways I was still processing. December brought the industry conference circuit and with it a different kind of challenge. The California Coastal Hospitality Summit was the biggest event of the year. 1,500 hospitality professionals gathered in San Francisco to discuss industry trends, celebrate achievements, and network. 2 years ago, I'd attended anonymously while Clay gave a keynote speech about disrupting luxury hospitality. I'd sat in the back, watched him present data I'd compiled, listened to him describe innovations I'd developed, and felt invisible. This year was different. Catherine was giving the opening keynote, and Pacific Luxury had a prominent booth showcasing our California properties. I was attending not as anonymous operations staff but as Director of Coastal Operations, with my name on the conference materials and my photo in the program. Catherine's speech was impressive. She talked about the changing luxury market, about what travelers valued post-pandemic, about operational excellence versus Instagram aesthetics. And then midway through she said something that made my chest tighten. "The most transformative acquisitions aren't about properties, they're about people." This year, Pacific Luxury was fortunate to partner with Blair Hartwick, who brought operational genius and cultural integrity that most consultants can't teach because they've never actually built anything themselves. Her work has transformed not just our California portfolio but our entire approach to hospitality. The audience applauded. 1,500 people acknowledging work that had been invisible for 17 years. After Catherine's speech, people approached me constantly. Some were genuine, competitors offering respect, colleagues congratulating me on the Pacific Luxury success. Others were clearly fishing for gossip about the Crescent Bay situation. Everyone in hospitality knew the story by now. The sister who got fired, who owned the land, who brought down her brother's career. It had become industry folklore. A cautionary tale about family business and corporate betrayal. "I heard Clay's in Arizona now," one consultant said to me at the networking reception. "Different industry entirely. Must feel satisfying to watch that play out." "It feels complicated," I said honestly, then excused myself. In my hotel room that night I ordered room service and cried. Not sad tears exactly, but exhausted ones. Being celebrated professionally while grieving privately created a strange dissonance. Success didn't fill the holes that betrayal had carved out. It just made them more visible. January brought an unexpected phone call. David Brennan, a vendor we'd worked with for years at Crescent Bay. He'd supplied our organic produce, built relationships with local farmers, understood what we were trying to create. "Blair, I need to give you a heads up about something," he said, his tone careful. "Clay contacted me last week." My stomach dropped. What did he want? He's in Arizona working commercial real estate. But apparently word got around about what happened at Crescent Bay. He's having trouble building credibility, getting clients to trust him. He asked me to reach out to you. I closed my eyes. "And say what exactly?" "He wants you to clarify the situation with industry contacts. He thinks if you just explain that the conflict was a misunderstanding, that Summit Coastal was a separate venture that got mischaracterized, that his resignation was voluntary, it would help him rebuild his reputation. The audacity was almost impressive. Clay had committed corporate espionage, stolen proprietary information, recruited staff with knowledge transfer agreements, planned to acquire properties after forcing distressed sales, and fired me with rehearsed cruelty. And he wanted me to rehabilitate his reputation. Did he apologize? I asked, though I already knew. No, David said quietly. He framed it as both of you made mistakes, family conflict got messy, but now you've succeeded, so maybe you could help him move forward too. There was. Clay still fundamentally didn't understand what he'd done wrong. He saw our conflict as a business competition that got out of hand, not as betrayal that destroyed trust. He thought reputation was something you managed rather than something you earned through actual integrity. Tell him no, I said. Tell him I won't lie to protect him from truth. He made choices. These are the consequences. I figured, David said. But I thought you should know he's trying. After we hung up, I sat with the confirmation that reconciliation was impossible. Not because I was holding a grudge, but because Clay had learned nothing. He'd destroyed our family, betrayed people who trusted him, stolen from our grandmother's legacy, and he wanted me to fix it so he could start over with a clean slate. Some people couldn't be saved from themselves. In February, Margaret called with a request I'd been dreading. Clay is visiting this weekend, she said, her voice tentative. I'd like us all to have dinner together. Nothing formal, just family. Every instinct screamed at me to refuse. But I heard something in her voice, hope mixed with desperation, a mother wanting her children to reconcile, wanting the family fracture to heal. I'll come, I said finally. But Mom, I won't pretend everything is fine. And I won't lie to make him comfortable. I understand, she said, though I wasn't sure she did. Saturday evening, I drove to Carmel for the first time since Clay had been there. His rental car was in the driveway. Some generic sedan, a far cry from the Tesla he used to drive. Walking through the door felt surreal, like visiting a museum of my old life. Clay stood in the living room. He looked thinner, older somehow, though it had only been 7 months since the board meeting. His confidence was gone, replaced by something harder and more defensive. We made brief eye contact. He nodded. I nodded back. Like acquaintances, not siblings. Margaret played hostess with forced cheer, asking about Clay's Arizona work and my Pacific luxury projects as though they were pleasant small talk rather than loaded subjects. I answered politely but minimally. Clay described his commercial real estate job with enthusiasm that couldn't hide his bitterness about starting over at 35 in a new industry, in a new state with a damaged reputation. Dinner was painful. Long silences filled with the clink of silverware, surface-level conversation that avoided anything real. Margaret tried desperately to create normalcy, to pretend we were just family catching up. Then over dessert she made her move. I'm grateful we can all be together again, she said, her voice trembling. Family is what matters most. And I really hope, we can find our way back to each other. Clay seized the opening immediately. I agree. Blair, what happened between us was unfortunate. But we're still family. Maybe it's time to move past it. Unfortunate. That single word detonated something in me. Move past it. I set down my fork carefully. Clay, you fired me after 17 years. You stole proprietary information to build a competing company while running ours. You recruited our staff with contracts requiring them to transfer knowledge they'd developed at Crescent Bay. You planned to acquire properties after forcing the company to sell them at distressed prices. That's not unfortunate. That's calculated betrayal. His face flushed. You're still bitter about a business decision. You need to let it go, Blair. Grow up. A business decision? My voice was quiet but intense. You destroyed trust. You violated every ethical obligation you had as CEO. You tried to steal our grandmother's legacy and rebrand it as your achievement. Those aren't business decisions, Clay. They're moral failures. Please, Margaret interrupted, tears streaming down her face. You're both my children. Can't we find forgiveness? I looked at my mother and felt profound sadness. Mom, forgiveness requires acknowledgement. Clay hasn't apologized. He hasn't taken responsibility. He literally just asked me to lie to industry contacts to rehabilitate his reputation. That's not someone seeking forgiveness. That's someone wanting me to help him avoid consequences. I stood, gathering my coat from the back of my chair. I love you, Mom. I'll keep having our weekly dinners. But I won't sit at a table with someone who betrayed me and won't even acknowledge what he did. That's not family. That's performance. And I'm done performing. I left without looking back, hearing Margaret's sobs and Clay's voice raised in protest behind me. In my car, I sat in the darkness for 10 minutes, hands gripping the steering wheel, breathing slowly until my heart rate settled. Setting that boundary had hurt. But it was necessary. I'd spent 17 years being the accommodating one, the reliable daughter, the sister who sacrificed for family harmony. That version of myself had been erased by betrayal. This version valued truth over comfort. And if that meant holidays alone, I could live with that. Spring arrived with wildflowers covering the coastal hills and clear blue skies that seemed to stretch forever. One evening, after a long day overseeing renovations at our Big Sur property, I found myself sitting alone on the beach watching the sunset. I'd been turning everything over in my mind. The termination, the betrayal, the board meeting, Clay's resignation, Summit Coastal's collapse. I'd expected revenge to feel satisfying, like finally being proven right, like justice served and wounds healed. But it hadn't felt that way at all. Clay facing consequences hadn't healed the wound. It had just confirmed what I'd lost. The brother I'd once had, the family I'd thought we were, the belief that loyalty mattered. But something else had happened that I was only beginning to understand. For 17 years, I'd carried the exhausting weight of pretending everything was fine. Pretending Clay's lack of recognition didn't hurt. Pretending being the invisible backbone was enough. Pretending loyalty would eventually be reciprocated. The betrayal and revenge had burned away all that pretense. And in the space left behind, I could finally see the wound clearly. Not just the acute injury of being fired, but the chronic injury of being systemically undervalued. And seeing it clearly meant I could finally address it. I was building a career identity not shaped by family obligation. I was establishing boundaries that were real rather than performative. I was grieving the family I'd thought I had instead of pretending it might magically appear. Revenge hadn't healed the wound. But it had created space where actual healing could happen. Space where I could build something based on my values rather than family expectations. The foundation had survived everything. And on that foundation I was building something true. I was sitting on that beach watching the sunset when my phone buzzed with a text from Sophia. Did you realize it's been exactly a year since you left Crescent Bay? Feels like you've always been with Pacific Luxury. A year. I'd been so focused on building, on moving forward, that I hadn't even registered the anniversary. The Crescent Bay chapter felt distant now, like something that had happened to a different version of myself. Someone younger, more willing to accept invisibility, still believing that loyalty would eventually be reciprocated. The next morning, I drove to Grandview Coast for a routine property walkthrough. It was something I did weekly at each location, checking details that most executives would delegate but that I'd learned mattered immensely. The small things that separated adequate hotels from exceptional ones. I arrived during the afternoon shift change, when day staff briefed evening staff on guest needs and ongoing issues. The kind of operational continuity that only happened when people took genuine pride in their work. Standing on the infinity pool deck, I watched the choreography of excellence I'd spent a career building. A housekeeper named Jennifer checked a room turn-down setup. Pillows positioned precisely, curtains adjusted for optimal light, the origami crane on the pillow that guests photographed and posted on social media. She wasn't following a checklist. She was creating an experience. At the front desk, I watched Marcus greet a couple who'd stayed with us 6 months ago. Welcome back, Mr. and Mrs. Chin. We have you in the same ocean view room you requested. And I took the liberty of stocking the minibar with the sparkling water you preferred last time. The couple looked genuinely touched. That was the difference. Anticipating needs before they were stated, making people feel remembered and valued. A maintenance supervisor named Tom coordinated a minor plumbing repair in a vacant room, timing it during low traffic hours to avoid disturbing guests. He'd worked with me at Crescent Bay for 12 years before following me to Pacific Luxury. He understood that maintenance wasn't about fixing problems. It was about preventing guests from knowing problems existed. Catherine found me on the deck, tablet in hand. Quarterly reports just came in, she said, handing me the device. All 6 properties exceeded revenue projections. Staff retention is at 94%, highest in Pacific Luxury's history. and guest satisfaction scores are leading the entire region. I scrolled through the data, feeling something I'd rarely experienced at Crescent Bay: unambiguous professional pride. Not pride overshadowed by watching someone else take credit, not satisfaction filtered through family dysfunction, but clean recognition that the work was excellent and everyone knew it. You know what's different here? I said slowly, working through thoughts as I articulated them. At Crescent Bay, everything I built was tangled with family dynamics. My excellence was always filtered through my mother's favoritism toward Clay, through his need to take credit, through the narrative that I was support for his vision. I was creating something remarkable, but I could never just enjoy it. There was always this awareness that my contributions would be minimized or erased. I paused, watching the Pacific catch the afternoon light. Here the work is just the work. It speaks for itself. And that's enough. Catherine nodded with understanding. Family businesses are complicated. We've built something cleaner. Later, alone in my office, I recognized the profound truth. I'd created something more meaningful at Pacific Luxury in 1 year than in 17 years at Crescent Bay. Not because the work itself was different, but because the context allowed it to be seen clearly. Excellence without dysfunction. Recognition without conditions. Success that was actually mine. My weekly dinners with Margaret had settled into a comfortable rhythm, something neither of us had expected. We'd meet at different restaurants around the coast, quiet places where we could talk honestly without audience or performance. Margaret had transformed in unexpected ways. After selling her Crescent Bay shares and stepping away from the company entirely, she'd embraced retirement with surprising enthusiasm. She traveled constantly, weeks exploring Tuscany, a month hiking in New Zealand, river cruises through Europe that she'd always been too busy for. I think I forgot how to exist outside of work, she told me one evening over dinner at a small French restaurant in Carmel. After your father died, Crescent Bay became my entire identity. I pushed Clay into leadership because I needed someone to carry that forward, to validate all the years I'd invested. She paused, choosing words carefully. I didn't recognize I was sacrificing you to preserve my own vision of what the company should become. We talked honestly now in ways we never had before. Margaret acknowledged patterns I'd lived with for decades. Being positioned as support rather than leadership, having my expertise valued but not recognized, watching Clay receive credit for work I'd done. I told myself it was practical, she said. Clay was charismatic, good with investors and media. It made sense to make him the public face. But I didn't see how that positioning was actively harming you until it was too late to fix it. The acknowledgement couldn't undo 17 years of impact, but it mattered. We also talked about Clay, though carefully. He was still in Arizona, working in commercial real estate with moderate success, but nothing like the trajectory he'd imagined for himself. He reached out to Margaret occasionally, emails and phone calls where he positioned himself as the wronged party, the victim of my vindictiveness and the board's overreaction. He still doesn't understand what he did wrong, Margaret said quietly. He sees it as a business conflict that got messy, not as betrayal that destroyed trust. I know, I said. I keep hoping he'll take real responsibility. That maybe someday we could rebuild some version of family. But I'm accepting that might not happen. I took her hand across the table. You can love him and still acknowledge what he did. Those things aren't mutually exclusive. Our relationship would never be what it was before. We both understood that. But it was becoming something more real. Connection built on truth rather than performance. Love that acknowledged wounds rather than pretending they didn't exist. It was better even though it hurt more. 3 months after the anniversary of my termination, I attended the annual Hospitality Industry Conference in San Francisco. I was browsing vendor booths when I heard my name. Blair Hartwick. I turned to find James Morrison, a former Crescent Bay operations manager I'd hired and trained a decade ago. We'd lost touch after my termination, and seeing him felt like encountering a ghost from my past life. James, how are you? We found a quiet corner cafe and caught up over coffee. He'd stayed at Crescent Bay after I left, hoping the transition would stabilize. It hadn't. Blair, it's bad, he said, lowering his voice. Really bad. After you left and Clay resigned, the board brought in a management consulting firm to run operations. They treat the properties like assets to optimize rather than experiences to create. He showed me his phone, recent online reviews with consistent themes. declining service standards, dirty rooms, indifferent staff, maintenance issues that lingered for days. They've cut training budgets by 60%, James continued. Reduced staff to absolute minimum coverage. Replaced most of your vendor relationships with cheaper national contracts. Guest satisfaction scores have dropped 40% across all properties. I thought about the relationships I'd built. The organic produce supplier who sourced from local farms, the linen company that understood our quality standards, the maintenance contractors who responded within hours because we'd treated them fairly for years. The properties you built, Monterey, Big Sur, Laguna Beach, they're shadows of what they were, James said. Revenue is declining, reputation is damaged. Meanwhile, everyone in the industry is talking about what you're doing at Pacific Luxury. Grandview Coast is booked solid 6 months out. You're getting featured in magazines, speaking at conferences. You've basically proven that Crescent Bay's success was your success, not the brand or the locations. The validation was unexpected and profound. For 17 years I'd wondered if my value was real or just dependent on context. The Crescent Bay name, the property's prime locations, the established reputation. Now I had definitive proof. The properties declined without me while new properties thrived with my leadership. Does it feel good? James asked. Watching them struggle while you succeed? I considered the question honestly. It feels like confirmation. Not that I wanted them to fail, but that my contributions were real. For so long I felt invisible. Now I know the work mattered, the impact was real, and it was mine. We talked for another hour before parting. As James left, he said, most of the staff who stayed regret not following you to Pacific Luxury. They thought family loyalty mattered. They learned the hard way that your leadership mattered more. Walking back to my hotel, I felt something shift. I'd spent months questioning whether destroying Clay's career had been necessary or vindictive, whether I should have found another way. Now I knew, I hadn't destroyed anything. Clay had. I'd simply refused to be buried in the rubble. Late afternoon sun streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows at Grandview Coast as I conducted my final walkthrough of the day. This had become my routine, ending each week at the flagship property, checking details, observing staff, ensuring excellence. I walked through the lobby where guests relaxed with wine and conversation, past the restaurant where our chef prepared local seafood with ingredients from relationships I'd cultivated, through the staff areas where people worked with dignity because they knew they mattered. In my office, a real office with ocean views, not a converted storage room, my grandmother's compass sat on the desk beside quarterly reports showing all 6 properties exceeding projections. I thought about everything that had brought me here. 17 years of invisible work. My brother's betrayal. My mother's favoritism. The revenge that hadn't healed wounds but had created space where healing could happen. I thought about Clay in Arizona starting over and felt not satisfaction but acceptance that some people never learn. I thought about Margaret trying to rebuild our relationship through honesty rather than pretense. I thought about staff who'd trusted my leadership and been rewarded for that trust. And I thought about my grandmother scouting coastal properties with nothing but determination and a compass, building something from nothing through integrity rather than entitlement. Success wasn't about corner offices or CEO titles or family validation. It was about building something solid enough to weather betrayal, valuable enough that others would fight to preserve it, meaningful enough to be worth protecting, even if protection required transformation. The foundation remained. Companies changed, relationships evolved, families fractured, identities shifted. But the foundation of who I was, what I valued, how I worked, that remained solid. Clay had tried to erase me, but he'd only proven my worth by revealing what happened when I was gone. As I prepared to leave for the evening, I took one last look through my office window. Guests checking in with smiles. Staff moving with purpose. The Pacific stretching infinite beyond the property. I'd lost a family business but built a professional legacy. Lost a brother but gained clarity about my own value. Lost the comfort of family belonging but gained the freedom of genuine recognition. The foundation remained. And on that foundation I'd built something true, earned through excellence, valued for what it was, completely and undeniably mine. Tomorrow I'd review reports, visit another property, continue building. Tonight I'd go home, pour wine, watch the sunset and feel something I'd rarely felt at Crescent Bay. Satisfaction in work that spoke for itself. The foundation remained. Everything else was just construction. And I'd finally learned to build from strength rather than loyalty that was never mutual. If this story of strategic justice had you hooked from start to finish, hit that like button right now. My favorite part was when Blair walked into that boardroom with evidence Clay never saw coming. What was your favorite moment? Drop it in the comments below. Don't miss more powerful revenge stories like this. Subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss an upload.